Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Hello. Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Lori.
Testing, 1, 2. Hi. No? Hello. Huh?
Hello. Testing, 1, 2. Testing, I'm speaking.
Hi.
Testing. No, I just need YouTube again. YouTube again. Oh, okay. It's funny. Testing. Testing. Cool. Yes.
Which one? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our panel discussion, Defining Home, which is going to be a survey of Bahamian architecture, art, and interior design in relation to our current exhibition here at Turn Gallery in This House is a Home by Heino Schmid. So I have the pleasure of being your moderator this evening. My name is Jody Minnis. I am the Exhibitions and Programming Director of Turn. And I'm joined here with three lovely panelists. So I will read their short but extensive bios now. So, firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Alexis Axe Roberts. Alexis is a cross disciplinary spatial designer with an affinity for leading with empathy in the design process. His commitment to uncovering the human aspects of design rises to the surface of his approach in his questions and solutions. His work seeks a balance between loved objects and client stories to weave spaces that evoke a sense of home. With a background in architecture, including a Master of Architecture and a Master of Fine Arts in Design for Sustainability from the Savannah College of Art and Design, Alexis has honed his skills through various professional experiences. His work as a member of a multidisciplinary interior architecture firm, J. Elder Studio, broadened his expertise to include creative pitch production and website design. Today, he brings a diverse set of skills to bear on projects such as a junior architect and interior designer for Alexio and Associates Limited, and adjunct professor of architecture at the University of the Bahamas. In 2018, he co-founded St. Rose Studio with his sister Savannah. The studio, a strategy and branding consultancy, quietly focuses on building brand expertise with global appeal. In addition to his professional pursuits, Alexis is driven by a love of travel, storytelling, and ethnographic research, all pillars that feed his desire to produce offerings that benefit all ecosystems. Alexis remains as a designer with his feet on the shores of Nassau, with his mind in the clouds and his heart focused on more responsible and hopeful future. Thank you, Alexis. So I think as we go along through the conversation, I'll introduce each panelist as we go, just to for a smoother transition. So we will begin our talk with discussing architecture. So Heino Schmidt's exhibition in this house is a home is a site where we have a chance to delineate between house and home, the structural aspects of it, but also the sentimentality and the ephemerality of what it means to create a home or exist in a home. And specifically, we're looking at, for those in the gallery, the works right behind us, and for those online, if you want to go to slide 3, home 1 through 4. So home 1 through 6, sorry. So I would begin. So these are collages. They're acrylic on paper by Heino Schmid. And this home is the repeating of a motif of the old Bahamian structure. It's quite dense in texture and opacity. So, Alexis, I wanted to speak to you specifically about this motif and kind of like, may you, Laurie, the history of this structure in particular in our islands, if you can.
So looking at Heino's work, the main frame of reference for this, I noticed that he repeated the motif of the gable roof. Now, we also have the hip roof right above us here. Both of those actually had been birthed in the 19th century by the British when they came here. We're not exactly sure if there was a particular architect who developed it, but with collaboration with the people that they brought here, some of the things that they saw were that hot air rises. This was something that you could do to have that rise within during the day and then have that cool air disperse at night. So one of the things that we see in the actual artwork itself is a reflection of the materiality of the home, but above it, the starkness of the wooded panels for shingles is something that I could see a little bit of. And it was something that really spoke to the strength that is provided by these certain architectural elements, something that has actually stayed with us even into our contemporary architecture that you can see today.
If we go to our next slide, I think we included a photo of, in the next one, we included a photo of Turn Gallery,
Mhm.
the gallery that we exist in, versus this home which is in Spanish Wells. So the gable is present in the home in
Mhm.
Spanish Wells, but also more of a contemporary take on the structure and the architecture of this building. So Turn actually started as a WeWork space. So I think the idea of creating a space that was comfortable enough to work in, but also create like a sense of I don't want to say comfort twice, but a space that you could like work in and live in for quite some time and come in that is balances like home and space, became our little gallery now that sits on the Island Houses property. So I guess that then references what you spoke about this contemporary.
So, despite us providing buildings beyond just the home, it's interesting that the pieces of architecture Bahamians have actually contributed to the rest of the world. The most famous of those tend to be homes. Some of the elements that you'll see actually is that the facade of homes tend to look like faces, which is something that allows us to have some poetic relationship and emotional attachment to them so that we would take better care of them. If you don't love the spaces that you're spending the most time beyond your daily work, it's unlikely that you would take care of that actual space and the structure itself. Architecture is a combination of engineering and art, the sciences and the arts. And so all of those things put together make sure that you're doing something beyond just providing a building. You're thinking about how people will use the space. But looking at Heino's description of his actual process for this actual show, something that was on his mind as he became a father was, how do you provide shelter? How do you provide a space that feels wonderful and inspiring as well to children, as well as the adults who take care of those children? And so a lot of the buildings that have emerged from Bahamian life and experience dealing with the climate itself have taken into account those things. How can you make the space still cool even though you're protecting yourself from the storm? So louvers and how they allow wind to pass through, although we're protecting you from the rain. Our first barrier between the elements and our safety tend to be roofs. So it's interesting to see that be a it's interesting to see that be one of the main motifs that showed up in the work itself. And go ahead.
Beautiful.
Mhm.
I think then I guess we were talking a little bit earlier about how we don't, at least not to my knowledge
Mhm.
yet, because I could always be wrong. The way that we define like architecture in these homes in relation to history, right? So you have like the clapboard house, and you have these structures, especially on the family islands. If you were to like drive around, you see like they're like decaying and they're like demolished. So it kind of like pinpoints that time when like cement blocks were like introduced, and now you have like these like very like stoic houses that are deteriorating on the family islands, to now where um, you think about Turn then, existing as this posh iteration of those spaces. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of how we define modern Bahamian
Mhm.
architecture in relation to like that history?
For sure. So architecture itself is a reflection of our priorities as a society. So one of those that we can never get away from is the climate that we live in, the weather. But in terms of showcasing, I don't want to say riches per se, but wealth, for example, or grandeur, has changed the scale at which we build. I'm really bad at that. Sorry. It's a little tight. So it's changed the way and the scale at which we build, even though some of the principles in the architectural structures have remained the same to a degree in terms of shape. Um, Concrete allowed us to expand in terms of resorts, and a lot of that has lent itself to the tourist industry, which we modeled and defined here for the rest of the world. But I would say it's a reflection of those who settled and colonized here and how long they intended to stay.
Okay.
And what they found out very quickly is there are harsh conditions in the subtropical Bahamas, in the
Right.
archipelago itself. So sometimes those things don't hold up very well. We're starting to realize that concrete, for example, although it served us well to a degree, it's not one-on-one or on par with the sustainability that we need to have. So while it's working for now, we know that we need to return to some of the traditions beyond and before colonial style architecture and design.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Mhm.
Could you like
Yeah.
expand on that
Mhm.
a little as well?
Which
Because, like,
part?
I mean, I don't like. I really don't know a whole lot about like, what goes into actually building.
Give
a
it
house.
a-
Sorry, I personally don't know like a lot about like what actually goes into like building a house, and it's just like, I mean, I'm from Grand Bahama, so like if you don't build a house that's concrete, you're being ridiculous, right? So it's just like I'm just really really curious to like hear about like what kind of ways you want to like take some of the older sort of ways that we were building and sort of maybe replacing concrete. Is that what I'm hearing, or like changing how we use it? I don't know, like just a little bit more about that for my own curiosity.
So I brought it up because on the other side of the wall that everyone's sitting in front of, there's a CMU block, which is introduced by the Britishers when they
The breeze block.
the concrete CMU block,
Okay.
which was a 20th century. It took off in the 20th century, the mid 20th century here. But before that, we built with a lot of local materials that didn't need to be mixed in that way. So we had stone, we had coral, and those elements
Lines.
were more readily available without having to um, add so much material to make these blocks that would then be rigid structures that didn't bend as palm trees do or as wood structures do. And one of the things that we had with the wooden structure was that they were not nailed, they were pegged.
Right.
And so, like the palm tree, they bended like ships, which was actually a process of building that Britishers brought because they were skilled shipbuilders. So man of war, for example, in the Abacos, is is a site where a lot of that was taking place, and we built skilled builders, not necessarily architects, who would build in a way that was appropriate for the landscape. So concrete changed in the way that it was modular and that we could repeat structures in a way that brought order in the Georgian style, or the federal style it's also known, in a way that expressed their ideals and how they wanted to live. Now, with collaboration with African descended Bahamians, they were allowed to expand the veranda to have a sense of community. And so the wooden structures supported that already. They had to figure out how to do that with the concrete as well. But we've now reinterpreted the way that we built with the wooden structures with concrete. But what we're doing in the industry itself and the discipline is finding ways to innovate so the concrete is lighter, don't have to use so much of it. But it's not perfected yet, so it's not the
Understood.
standard.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you said that. I didn't reference it here, but I think about Leanne Russell's practice. Like after she documented um, her hometown in Abaco, and she realized that the markings on the wood in certain structures were so that after hurricanes they would be able to like put the structures back together again because they anticipated that destruction, and the architecture then like made room for the rebuilding process so that
Mhm.
like which is also a very interesting engagement with the climate and the landscape at that
Yeah.
time. So
It was an
thank you.
acknowledgement of this is what we're dealing with.
Right, right. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think we could I will pause here as we kind of transition and weave Bahamian art history into to introduce our second panelist, who is Natalie Willis Wiley. Um, Willis Wiley is a British Bahamian curator and cultural worker born and raised in Grand Bahama. She received her BA with honors, an MA in fine art at York St. John University in the UK before returning home. Following her 6-year tenure at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, Willis now works independently as a curator, art writer, and curatorial consultant. Her work centers on themes of identity, Caribbean subjectivity, and representation. In addition to contributing the bulk of the archive of scholarship on works in the National Collection, Willis is also responsible for some key firsts in the museum's history. She was the first curator at the museum to include bilingual wall text in English and Creole, the first to have a group show dedicated to the work of Black women artists of the Bahamas, and she also co-curated the museum's first inter-island traveling exhibition, ensuring access to the national collection within the Family Islands. Her double Dutch exhibition for the NAGB titled Ancestral Remains to be Seen was reviewed by Miguel Lopez in Art Forum in 2022. Hi, Natalie.
Hi.
Yeah, I think that this is a good segue because I have been obsessing over Haino's piece in the show Seascape, because I think it's the most beautiful inclusion of color for, you know, a very transformative reason that I've ever seen. But Seascape then took me to the archive where I looked at William Henry Jackson's Negro Cabin, Fox Hill, and I referenced that because Bahamian art history kind of starts because of the lack of like documentation and actually like trying to define who is Bahamian and whose work should then be like the genesis of our art history. We kind of started at we started at the work of William Henry Jackson and Jacob Coonley. So we have like a very deep photographic history. And in this archive, we find that Jacob and Jackson and Coonley, they document Bahamian life between 1901 and the late 1800s, really early 1900s. They document Bahamian like domestic life in a very specific gaze for exportation. And here we have this beautiful seascape, and I wanted to talk about with you in particular, Natalie, the documentation of Bahamian architect throughout the art historical canon in the Bahamas. What does that documentation inform us of as, you know, a nation trying to like define itself? Alexis just spoke about how the inclusion of concrete was a response. The way that we built with wood was a response. So what is this documentation telling us about our response to the landscape, how we our like personal cultures and so on?
I think there's been a lot of variation in the way that like Bahamians have obviously dealt with like how we treat dwellings in art history in general. So like we have a lot of old colonial imagery that had a very particular function around trying to present the Bahamas as a certain kind of tropical like ideal, an idyllic space. And we're very used to seeing the quaint imagery, and the quaintness kind of belies the actual violence that everybody was like enduring at the time and the poverty that people were like enduring at the time, because it's like, oh, how cute and lovely this is, and it's like, no, people are struggling, right? So we kind of go from a lot of this like colonial photography that was specifically for sort of perpetuating the paradise myth into having people actually start to dig into what Bahamian domesticity is and what it looks like and what it means for us. And in particular, I think it's really, really important to mention just in Bahamian art history in general, but also like just with the care that he did it with. But like Maxwell Taylor really made such a point of moving past the tourist narratives that we saw in all the colonial imagery that we still perpetuate all this stuff today.
Right.
Like we're still working on the same 200 odd year old image, like problematic is a nice word for it. But Maxwell Taylor really made a very concerted effort of making sure that we understood what was happening behind the facades of these spaces, right?
Right.
So, and this is like, I'm kind of gonna try to go through a little bit, but like the fact that Maxwell Taylor was like specifically dealing with having Black Bahamian life and its rawness and its realness being displayed when that is such a big no-no for tourism, because we don't want to make struggle, right? Point of making that like a focal point of his practice. And I think because he took that space up, I think everybody else is kind of able to kind of figure out how they want to deal with things, right? Does that make sense? It's like almost like it's like two ends of the scale.
Right.
So like we have all the old colonial imagery, but then we also have Maxwell Taylor, and then following on in that lineage, I would say Tamika Galanis and the way that she deals with what she calls the Bahamian interior. And for Galanis, the inside of the home, not the outside that we see that looks all quaint and cute as a seascape, right? The actual interior where it's like you have like, you know, your doilies and lace and everything else, and it's maybe a little bit like, you know, run down, but I'm very proud and she crocheted that tablecloth. You know what I mean? Like there's like all that kind of stuff. Like she takes a really, really intentional care with that I think falls under the lineage of like Maxwell Taylor. That's really
Mhm.
interesting. And I think that the way that Taylor and Galanis specifically are dealing with the interior of the building was kind of the start of delineating that difference between like house as a structure and home as a dwelling.
Right. Yeah.
And then you have Hino. And I think that it's really, really interesting the way that Hino's dealing with exterior surfaces as a way of talking about what a home is, because we often talk about the outside being facade. And because Hino's dealing with like a very new period of his life where it's like, new family, new home, trying to figure out what it means to like build these things. It's like we get to see his kind of very particular positioning because like for me as like a mixed race Bahamian as well, a mixed heritage Bahamian, it's like you do come to things from like a different kind of understanding, not because it's not the same as everybody else, it's just there's also something else. There's something else that's like affecting the way that you think. And for me anyway, I just really, really enjoy the way that kind of was treating even just the structures of like the framing of his work feels
Yeah.
like building.
Yeah.
We have like pillars
Yeah.
that go to nowhere that aren't necessarily supporting anything, but they're pillars. And it's
Yeah.
like it gives the significance of a pillar. Like he's dealing with the interior stuff, but on the outside,
Yeah. So
which is like wild for me.
yeah, I took the obvious route and I went straight to Eddie Menace. I was like, okay, Bahamian architecture
Yeah.
and art, Eddie Menace, which is in our
Mhm.
next slide.
Mhm.
But if you go to it, I think I was sitting in the
Yeah.
office talking to Amanda about it, and there's like community that like erupts in this space as well. So turn the physical gallery space not only mimics the interior of a home, or does like it not only feels homey, but it also from your vantage from a specific vantage point, it becomes a community. And
Mhm.
there has been like a history of documentation of community specifically through Eddie Menace's work, where the Bahamian domestic becomes less about our interior spaces but our collective space,
Mhm.
and how does the Afro Bahamian like exist in that space, things are integral to the sustaining of that community. And then the houses being close in proximity to one another, the people with the shack across the street, like all of this is an ecosystem that's necessary for the support of one another. And I think you see that then too happening with this like repetition in the exhibition of Pine House
Because it's
houses.
investigation, right? Like that's the thing. And that's
Yeah.
what I really like is like I feel like what I've always enjoyed about your practice, Hina. So it said
Pine House in the audience for persons
who
viewing
can't
us
see.
online.
But I just think that there's something really beautiful about the fact that your practice always feels like it's questioning things. It's not trying to give people an answer. It's just like, this is very interesting. We do this all the time. Me and Jody were talking about this just now as well. And it's like, this is something that I've noticed that happens in Bahamian every day. Why is that? This is interesting. Let me just kind of reflect that back at you for a second so you can just think about it. You know what I mean? It's just like, we are used to seeing like breeze blocks
Yeah.
around, you know what I mean? But we're not used to seeing them in a context that maybe, for me anyway, we're now thinking about them in terms of like the soft domestic interior because again, so many references to like children and almost like for me, like playing house or like children's toys, like rattles and things, because there's like the sort of, the
The assemblages.
yeah, the
Yeah.
assemblages of small ones, like they feel like you're dealing with like building blocks and like all these other things. And there's something that's very playful and like cheeky about it. And it's like, I don't think I've personally seen anybody deal with architecture in the Bahamas or, dwellings and like Bahamian home spaces
Past
in
the
that particular way.
aesthetics, past
Right.
the aesthetic
Because
quality.
this is a
of-
reference to
yeah,
a house, not a house,
right.
right?
Yeah,
Like it's not
yeah.
supposed to be, this is a home. It's like this automatically makes you feel like that's what it is because it's pared back.
Yeah.
Right? And we're
Yeah.
very used to hyper embellishment, right? Within the Black diaspora and the arts, especially, like we're very used to seeing a lot of hyper embellishment. Like we're colorful people, you know what I mean? Like we find ways to like show up and take up space. But then when you pull things back, you actually have to really, really look at what it is that you have right there and what that brings out, I think, in people. And again, with between the fact that it's just these very simple structures that denote home, even though it's a bunch of rectangles, and you know what I mean? Like it's just there's something that's really, really beautiful about that. And I think that in the Bahamas, we're very used to having very little and making a lot of meaning out of it. And I think
Yeah.
that the work kind of reflects that in a really beautiful way for
Yeah.
me.
And I think if we go to the next series of images, uh, I reference Nastasia Pratt's work. So Nastasia
Mhm.
is a relief artist, I would say. So she looks
Mhm.
at old Bahamian homesteads and then she creates watercolors, which then she builds off of. Because I think Nastasia actually has a background in architecture.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, pardon?
Mhm.
Yeah, architecture and urban
Mhm.
planning. And and then she, creates these like very specific foam
Mhm.
and wooden structures on top of it.
Mhm.
Then you have home, Our Sunday Best by Heino Schmidt, which is in 2018. So I I paired them because, like Natalie said, Heino is an observer. So the first work that the archive of the internet would tell me that Heino then did
Mhm.
surrounding homes was in 2008, and it was a very dense charcoal drawing of a home. So it would reference something like a Chan Pratt or an
Mhm.
Eddie Minutes, where they take very keen attention to the architecture, the slating,
Mhm.
where the window is positioned to the door
Mhm.
versus the curve of the building.
Mhm.
But then here, it's less about
Mhm.
the it's less about the architecture. And like you said,
Mhm.
it's more about the implications of the home.
And there's also something, sorry, my brain just like kind of went here, but like there's
It's
also something really beautiful. Just sort of realized, like, you know how Maxwell Taylor deals with black struggle and has very labor intensive processes.
Yeah,
There's something really beautiful about using charcoal to make a home when so many homes are like made of wood and everything else. There's like
yeah,
a nice little cyclical sort of
Yeah.
the method fits the thing, you know what I mean? That I kind of really enjoy. That
yeah,
I think is really
yeah.
beautiful. Sorry. I was
It's
like,
okay. It's
but
okay.
yeah.
And I want us to have time to like flesh all of this out later.
Mhm.
So I will next to talk to. Um,
Thank
and
you.
our next panelist is Lori Tynes. Tynes is an award-winning and published designer based in Nassau, the Bahamas, with the lasting impact of witnessing the creative and cultural development of the Bahamas as a young woman. Tynes decided to study interior design at Ringling College of Art and Design. During her time in the U.S., she interned at Hirsch Bender in Atlanta, Georgia, and worked with Human Contact Interiors in Orlando, Florida. 8 years later, Tynes moved back to New Providence and worked with local companies like Bahama, SMB, and Rumors Limited. In 2015, Tynes launched Lori Tynes Design Ltd., a Bahamian-based interior design studio offering services in residential and commercial designs. Here, she serves as the principal interior designer, catering to properties in Abaco, Albany, Ocean Club, and Old Fort Bay, to name a few. In 2021, Tynes was named one of the New York City Journal's top 30 women disruptors to look out for, and received numerous acknowledgments and design awards. So thank you, Lori, for being here.
Oh, thank you for having
Of course. Yeah, so like Natalie said, I was in conversation with Tamika Galanis during as a part of programming for the Atlantic World Art Fair, and it was a live stream on Instagram. I think this had to be in last year, time 2000, between 2001 and 2022. And Tamika started talking about the Bahamian interior. What does the Bahamian interior look like, and documenting that and really fleshing that out. So I guess that goes back to what I was talking to Alexis about naming and defining kind of like architectural moments. So what does the interior landscape of the Bahamas look like from a perspective? Um, I think if we continue on, there is an image by Dave Smith um, that I quite enjoy from 1982. It's called Art in a Home in Nassau. And if anybody's like me, I grew up. Uh, it's such a good piece, right? Yeah, my grandparents' homes were decorated with Brent Malone prints, Eddie Minnis prints, but also like a slew of Haitian slew of like Cuban art as well. So I guess I'm asking, as someone who is, prompted constantly to create interiors and to fabricate a sense of home within a specific local context, what is the Bahamian interior to you, or how would you mark that out?
In general, you have to start from the because the Bahamas, the architecture, the way we build our
Good.
structures, oh, sorry, our structures and everything is designed for airflow, for protection, for, you know, so that you could reduce heat and all of these kind of things. So it starts from the outside. And then when you take a look at the actual architectural landscape, it has layers and depth and materials that we use constantly that we then do on the inside. So we protect from the outside, and then once we're inside, we use some of these materials again, such as like straw, just used often. Um, Bringing in the outside in, which is the landscape. But you would notice that a lot of our artwork has art, landscaping, painting, constantly repeated because we bring the outside in
Oh,
color as well. So, so the Bahamian interior, I would say, would always have a constant flow and layers and depth and textures and definitely color. Um, I always get asked, "Oh, I really want a modern home," but I always add a little Bahamian to every space that I create, and where it's a straw rug, or maybe there's a accent lamp or lighting. There's textures that are repeated in our landscape that I tend to bring inside,
mm,
and color as well. I think it's important for us to be looking at this beauty all the time, for us not to have it within our home.
yeah.
And then we talk about community. The Bahamian layout and landscape, once you enter the home, it's the public space. So you have the kitchen, you have the dining room, you have the living room, and it's all open and everybody's gathered
Right.
together as a family. And then you have a private space, which is the dwelling. Um, that's what we have now. Before, like I would say, my grandparents' house, we used to have separate spots. So our kitchen, we have a kitchen and the dining room and the living space outside, and then you go into your private dwelling. So socialization is important for our interior spaces as well. Now that we have it in one building.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Uh,
We
no, it's good.
no. Correct, correct. Like my grandmother's house is still separated in Long Island. So she has her kitchen, dining room in one space and her outdoor lounge in one space. And then in the actual home, we have a little sitting room, but it's just for bedroom. It's just for nesting. So once we turn off, she doesn't even have, she doesn't focus on having TVs or anything electronic in that space. That's a space for rest, and that's it. So I think that once we moved into the single building as a structure for a home, um, we kept those elements of gathering when you enter, but then also separating, having this private space, and then also a view from the outside in, which we duplicate again. So a lot of homes, if you notice, and they're doing that a lot. We did that in Harbor Island recently, where there's a picture. So you walk on the outside in, and then there's this photo of whether it's the landscaping or it's the ocean, but you're walking nature versus into the home. So then and you go into your private dwelling and you go into your public space.
Oh, that's,
Yeah, it's really we've been repeating it a lot lately, but it's just basically repeating the past. People think it's
mm,
new,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it's
yeah,
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 it's
yeah. I think I we included an installation by June Colley that she did at the Aguilar Art Foundation. Um, and I think
the
that
color,
yeah, it's what you said about color and
mhm,
pattern, and
textures,
textures. Yeah,
and also our history is big um, with these layers. So when you talk about the dolly and when you talk about these different fabrics that we've gotten,
right.
you know, throughout the time, and a lot of Bahamians still recover. They love recovering furniture because it brings something special and new, and then it also reintroduces that color and pattern and
And
layers.
right. So I guess I My brain is like,
I know it's just a lot. I'm sorry. My
yeah.
I don't know
But
about,
I think it's quite interesting that you brought up the public-private aspects of the home, like the home being your private space, but you also make allowances in your room. But I think as I look at Tamika Galanis's work and I photographed over time, so the work on the left is Miss Heart by Galanis, and something that Tamika brings up in her work and talks about these interiors is that you upon entering someone's homestead, you know who they prioritize. So there's like family photos everywhere.
right.
There's, like it's decorated with awards, it's decorated
Hmm.
with plaques and different things like that. Is that can you talk about the how then does that prioritization inform or how does that look like through history and how does that look through like object procurement and like
So we do
am
a,
I what?
we do a curated wall.
Yeah.
We make it sound so pretty. It's more organized, but
Yeah.
honestly, it's just a full wall. We're doing that now for a client, and it's just their awards, all the family photos in junction with some artwork, and it's just the way we display it gives it a new look. But the reality of the matter is, it's just the same thing. We want to show what our family has has won, or
Has that yeah
has done really, yeah,
has
and
achieved.
developed. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Do you wanna
It's a human expansion of ornamentation. And so, like you mentioned, the things and the elements that we have on the exterior of the building, we then add a human ornamentation to the interior. So fretwork, the siding of the buildings, all express to people what type of space this is,
Right.
including the roof and the other parts of the structure, but also the prioritization of biophilic elements and bringing nature in. I don't see a lot of plants in people's homes often in the Bahamas, not real ones,
yeah
but
yeah yeah yeah
right.
Mhm.
But it's interesting that, but then we'll have those landscapes and those elements that really say that we do have this ready for the exterior, but just not real
Yeah,
inside.
and yeah, so oh, you're good. Yeah, you, yeah,
Mhm.
yep.
It's just wonderful the conversation. We talking about exterior versus interior, and we talk about community. So can somebody just talk a bit about the porch and the importance of the porch to homes and dwelling and helping to unite a neighborhood community?
you wanna? I'm gonna expand on it, but I want you to start it, okay? So yeah.
Okay. So, referencing a picture of my great great grandmother, out on the porch looking over. She's known for her very serious stare. But the veranda and the porch were areas where you not only invited community to be in or the transition into interior space. It was also about being able to look over the community and keep an eye. So the village raises the child, right? Um, but it's a representation of when if you look, there's a book called Reminiscing,
Yeah.
photographs of the old Nassau, right, of old Nassau. And they talk about how the entire island was a destination. So you had mixed use buildings, even though they had similar scales. But we've gone away from that in a way because we have now the gated communities and the separation, we have zoning, which destroyed a lot of the initial planning of Nassau. Because one of the critiques we get all the time now is that Nassau is poorly planned, but that wasn't always the case. Exactly. And so a lot of those elements and organizations that we had were then called primitive and a representation of what our aspirations. And so
Oh,
we
okay.
can call, but you're talking about naming things a thing, right? And
Yeah.
so even our
That's what
gaze
it
and the way that we right? And now we in this negotiation of how do we now define this for what we truly want in the future.
But I feel like you
Mhm.
define the porch as an exterior space. For me,
Mhm.
that's an interior
Interior
space.
space.
Because
Mhm.
because I
Mhm.
feel as though like that's not, you've now entered my personal space, my home. I guess again, bringing it. So when
Mhm.
people come on your porch, that's home.
That's
You
why you
know,
sweep it all the
yeah,
time.
yeah, that's like,
Mhm.
and that's real island, and that's why people who then tend to rebuild feel it's essential to have a background porch. It's not about the structure, just not about the aesthetics, but that's a gathering place as well for families and the community.
I feel like there's some, sorry. I
It's
feel like
such a
there's,
special place for me, actually. I
yeah.
really love it.
I mean, I feel like everybody has like memories of being on somebody's porch at some
Yeah,
point,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But there's
All the stuff.
something, maybe this is like the little mixed kid perspective of there's something about a porch being between spaces, interstice between spaces. It's not interior and it's not exterior. It's both at the same time. And I like that personally. I'm just like, there's something really nice about it because it's like, if somebody comes on your porch and you want them there, it makes it feel like it's your interior space and you're dating, right? But if there's somebody who you don't know so necessarily well and you want to be able to talk to them, whatever, it's like, it feels like a safe, neutral space. It feels like people in your community who walk past, you could invite them up, say hi, whatever. Like, there's something about it where it feels like it gets to be both. Like that, but they're kind of losing the porch culture because like Keisha Oliver did like a piece on that for the NE8, the 8th National Exhibition. Yep, and she was basically documenting the fact that like our porches are kind of going, or like there's not the same sense of community and safety that people. And that's for all of the post-colonial awful reasons that we know and all the legacies that we live through. But I don't know. I feel like both of y'all are right, and that's why I was just like, wait a second.
New builds. So our
Mhm.
new builds are now like being dictated. But in reality is
Mhm.
that this is how we've always lived.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
had a
It's just being translated.
yeah,
right?
there's this
Mhm.
international architect. He came in, he was like, "Oh, I have this brilliant idea. Let me show you the plan."
I already laugh because I feel like I
And I
recognize
go,
that.
"Wow, okay." So like everything that Jackson Burnside didn't create
Mhm.
before, and like legitimately it's walking from, and it had the porch just wrap around, but then you're walking in the
Mhm.
outside in, and then you
Mhm.
have your private space and your public spaces separated,
Mhm.
which is like a standard in terms of architecture and interior design. But the way we change it up is just the use of
Mhm.
materials and the color preferences. Because again, we use a lot. So
Mhm.
when you tone it down, it makes it look like a completely different
Mhm.
context.
Mhm. I also feel like haven't we been having people come in our space for like a couple hundred years and telling us how to do things? It's like, no.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I know. It's like that's very nice, honey, but I know.
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
that's what it feels like.
it's fine. I mean, on file.
But they're bringing you something
Yeah,
because they know the space. So like for them,
right,
it's new,
correct.
right? It's like, oh my god, why wouldn't you do this? It's like
Yeah,
we know.
yeah.
We just don't always have the means and the support. But we know, and we've had ideas. We've had
With support
this.
because it's an island home and
Mhm.
a high end luxury home. They have the same elements,
Mhm.
but
Mhm. Mhm.
the availability to have those materials
Mhm.
aren't the same. But
So then the finish is different.
what we
Mhm.
do, what we have is luxury. I think that people
Mhm.
forget
Thank
to
you.
appreciate so much luxury. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, I don't want any cane in my house." I was like, "Just hire me as your designer. There's going to be cane there, okay? And you're gonna have straw there too, and
Mhm.
you're gonna
Mhm.
have elements that are Bahamian. It's Bahamian. What I create is modern, we can do contemporary, we can
Mhm.
do all kind traditional, but it's always like a touch of Bahamian, and I think that's important because that's where your space is.
Exactly.
You can't create something without a reflection of what's being built.
It's important to have something that's aware of its context,
Correct.
right? Like that's the thing.
Yeah.
Because like otherwise people just plant stuff and it doesn't look like it's for us and it's weird.
I just wanted to ask how air conditioning has changed or not changed everything. Air conditioning.
Slow air.
I wrote a
That's-
thesis on Okay, so the earlier reference that I made about the way Bahamians would have built, um, being called a primitive approach to architecture, introduction of the air conditioning was an economic move, much like elephant in the room that we've not really discussed much, slavery. And so when that was introduced, there was no need for the shutters in the way that they would allow wind to pass through. Um, and they still charge you, but some of those elements that we had made homes only lovable if the air conditioning was. So if your home fails you because of technology, it's not built in such a way that it will survive. It's very much indicative of the question that we ask all the time: if the lights work, architects still be architects. If we don't have, if we can't draw, if we can't build, if we don't understand what construction is like, if we're not taking into consideration context, which is site, climate, and experience, which is something that a lot of people leave as an afterthought, which is why interior often isn't brought in as a conversation from the very beginning,
I agree.
which we're working on it. But it's it's
Sometimes, so I
you-
really do. I cannot lie. I get if you send me if I send the drawings, I'm like, I can
and if we're smart, we'll
Yeah,
negotiate with the
please,
engineer to
just-
be
just
like,
about-
can we
yeah.
make this work?
Yeah, I'm not trying to interrupt the structure or
Mhm.
anything like that, but I do think that it's important to side out. We all know that there's elements that are essential for architecture and engineering and all of that, but people live inside. So how do you flow? How do you move? How do you live? How do you enjoy that space without understanding from the beginning that space? Because we can make the architecture look amazing, the
Mhm.
structure will be great, but how does that family? Yeah, how does that family function in there? And it's very important the functionality of the space.
And the air conditioner, just to put it quite simply, made us more reliant on that system rather than good design. So a home that can't be enjoyed when one piece of it feels it's not well designed, if it's not elevated for the clear space to water as well as wind, the blue that I see in some of these um, pieces here and the motifs as well, is such a thing that this should be basic. We start there. How can we make sure that this functions even if the lights are off during the day? Mhm. Mhm. Indeed.
Outside of performance. Vesuvians.
Right.
To be specific.
Yeah, fair point.
We gotta be honest. We gotta be honest.
Mhm.
You know.
Yeah.
Because wow, that too.
That's also tied to some trauma and things, eh?
That's what that is. Yeah.
We know, we know.
But if you think about it, like, okay, so Wild Time, that's completely covered.
Mhm.
They spent a long time. I don't think I've spent a lot of time.
That's true.
I haven't.
Well, maybe the height of some.
Somehow
Because it's
even,
passive cooling.
yeah, but it's also like the way the
Mhm.
building has been, where it's located, the airflow, and I think that that is related to outside the work. So that's why people not thinking, oh, I should just enjoy sitting outside. Yeah.
Yeah, began to consider that when we were talking about the porch and the reduction of the porch and also how I find how in communities that do not have porches because I live in a very urban space in Providence, um, and maybe one or two buildings have a porch, but then the porch is actually the road now. So like the street becomes like the gathering space, or the center space. Um, right. Yeah. Um,
The road in the old community.
No, you can't. And so the street becomes the porch, and the road becomes the site of performance. And the people who are looking out now, they sit on your porch if you have a porch, and then how do you deny them that like access of like watching? It's
And
very
conversation.
not pardon
And conversation.
and conversation. Yeah, so it's very interesting. But I in my negotiations of Seascape in particular as well, I started to negotiate like the ocean view, and I'm glad that you brought in that you made us aware that we're being kind of Nassau-centric sometimes in our speech about this because
Majority population. I can't even complain. Sorry. Majority population is in Nassau. I can't really complain, but everything gets centralized in Nassau, and we forget that like Nassau isn't how everybody lives. Often when we talk about nostalgically in Nassau is what people are so and that's the thing is like I don't want that to be somehow separate. Like people aren't actually living that as their truth still.
right.
It's just Nassau is just a different space, and it's gone through different cycles.
So I guess my question would be like, what do you see as the so like I want to ask, how do we then stop what happens in New Providence continuing to spill over and happen in other islands? Or can you? Like if I mean I don't know, I'm sorry.
A lot of governmental shifts, maybe
Have you been to
having.
Long Island? They're not trying to let you change
Long Island is also specific.
They are very
Like,
particular about
yeah.
I'm going to keep
Mhm.
my well in the back of my yard.
Yeah.
I will
Mhm.
drink from that. Okay.
The accent as you
Whether you tell me
Mhm.
or not. Okay.
Mhm.
And then when you think of Abaco as well, they it's their
Mhm.
so it's a nostalgic type of landscape that
Mhm.
it's gorgeous. So it's
And also it's been rebuilt after
correct.
because that's how much it's valued, right?
Right. And
Because
they
Dorian raised everything.
I know,
And then people are like, nope, this matters to us, so we're gonna make sure this comes back.
but they
Mhm.
and so you realize that the issues we have solved not necessarily the issues of the family island. Same
No.
thing with the Lutra Harbor Island.
Because every family island's different too. Because
Exuma as well.
Grand Bahama doesn't have old architecture, which people forget. You know what I mean? Because like and at least what I've noticed, there's not really a lot. There's maybe a couple buildings that's cool, but like not really like a bunch of like old houses, clapboard houses like Nassau or some of the other family islands, like even Abaco. Because I don't understand how Abaco still can have clapboard houses, even though we've both been through the same hurricanes the whole time. I sent it to my husband first. But like I don't understand because like for me, one of the big shifts like moving to Nassau was, oh my God, there's so many like old buildings. I was like, the history here. Of course it is. I knew this. I knew this. But seeing it is very different. Because I grew up in Grand Bahama where every other year we get a bad hurricane, people lose house, things just we're used to seeing new buildings go up very slowly over a long period of time because people can't afford it because they lost everything. And it's just again, that's a very specific family island context. It's not at all like Long Island. It's not at all like Bromley.
Right.
But
They're
like
all so
you would think
different.
Abaco would even be more similar, but it's not because demographic.
It is, sorry, I wanted to ask architectural wise, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. So I realized when we talk about Abaco and I remember thinking that it would be nice to go across the street to a house because it was made out of brick, right? In my mind, all the knowledge I've learned about structures, architecture, design, in my entire set of studies, right? Like, this is the house I should go to. Well, when we came back, it was only the facade. And so I was very traumatized because that was the house I had planned to go to because it was so for me, I had to like really sit back and think about it because my little wooden house, like you said, it twisted, but it was not devastated across the street. So the thing is, what do we do differently from that? That house thought it was going to be strong based on the fact that it didn't have the steel and the proper structure. So if the building is not built structurally sound, then it will break. So you can have a clapboard house structurally sound and can last.
Right.
You know what I mean? And people kept on questioning the um, our building codes. We have some of the best building codes in the world.
We do.
We
Yeah.
do. So when we drove by and we took a look at different buildings and why they survived and why didn't they survive, some area of that structure was put into the building, and that's why it didn't survive, not the lack of new codes. So
That makes sense. Yeah, no, I just was going to expand on my point because I see me being an observer. Like I know, I think that there's going to be like a shift of persons moving out of New Providence to the family house just because of like the cost of living. I mean, it's not that better at all, but I think access to land, and wanting to build, wanting to have your own space in these islands, it's very like limited here in New Providence now. So yeah, yeah. So it's a natural migration. It's bound to happen. But I want to have to say what sorry.
So other than the air conditioning, the other major court, the other major, the other major flaw that we saw with cities, which you can see it, was the death of the dream car. So the prioritization of the automobile meant that your cities were no longer built for people. The worst thing that we ever did was place highways in between communities so mothers could walk to the store with their kids. And so urban planning, an extension of architecture as well, on a different level, failed us in that way. Uh, so again, that was the breakdown of mixed use spaces because people couldn't access them. So it's all a conversation about access, and not just knowledge, but also regulation as well. And so what happens is even the formation of the Institute of Bahamian Architects was built on this notion that builders weren't always doing right by their clients because they weren't putting in the correct structures when they should have been. So that regulation too led to the 1994 Professional Architect Act. And so what we're doing is we're trying to streamline these things, but again, if those services are out of reach, if we're pricing people out of the Long Islands, out of the codes as well, they can't even build for themselves.
Right.
We're failing our society.
And I also, you, yeah, you make such a beautiful but simple point about like urban planning and like moving because as I was preparing for this exhibition and this talk, I began to talk to Heino a bit about like how this exhibition fits into the art historical canon, but also being a part of the conversation of like art and architecture, and then began to I started to find like a lull in the documentation of like homes and like outside spaces. Um, yeah, and I know for sure that the kind of this contemporary thinking about Bahamian art took a direct hit to very traditional like art practices. So there was this very specific apprehension to paint the beat scene and to paint like the home scene or whatever because artists yeah, and you didn't want to fall into a specific canon as a young Bahamian artist. But also, I think too that it is dangerous now to paint on the side of the road. I think that it's simple, but I think that also informs like how we are then from the lack of documentation of the landscape because I'm quite interested to see maybe 10 years from now photography curator do um an exhibition on like the changes in the Bahamian landscape for the past like 50 years, you know what I mean? But is that archive even available because people aren't really walking about with cameras in a specific kind of way because it's not a walkable city or it's you know what I mean? Like yeah, right. Yeah, I don't
I
make
used
any
I
sense.
know, I know. Sorry, but yeah.
Like in a way where the William Henry Jacksons and the Jacob family could like walk from like one side to the next or from up north and south and east and west. We don't have that same privilege. So then there's like a small chasm of young Bahamian photographers now who are skateboarding through New Providence, documenting. But that also then changes their relationship to uh, architecture and why they document. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. Does anybody in the audience have any questions as well? I know that you guys are just like reaching for the mic, but I wanted to ask. Or any questions online? No? No? Yes. For
So, looking at the Bahamian vernacular, for exterior to the interior, um, how do you see the? We touched on how everybody is now moving, will be moving back to islands, and what I've noticed, because most of my work is on the outer islands, and what I've noticed is a lot of Bahamians who are privileged enough to have properties and generation land, they go, there's now like at least an acre,
right.
and then they can build their homes there. And the idea of a gated community on any of the outer islands is absolutely cut, and which I absolutely love. Now, I live in a gated community. No, that was, trust
Like
me,
that, like
that
that.
was definitely true. That was a hard push, but I did it. Well, we did it. Sorry. But do you see the vernacular of that Bahamian homestead being recreated back here in Nassau? Like going back, going to the island, seeing their properties that they have in Mason's Addition, the inner city, and those areas, and Fox Hill, and those aspects of Nassau happening again, because everybody remembers those times when your grandmother or your mother or whoever was on that porch, someone was walking by, you had that conversation. That person was always in a rush, but they would sit at that walk talking for an hour and then move on. Or if you needed to get something from someone, you shout across the road. Those aspects of community. You always had your church spot nearby. Church will be, you'll have an Anglican, Baptist, Catholic church on the same road. Okay.
Choices, yeah,
And you
choices.
had your choices where you wanted to go. You had your convenience store. You had the local mechanic who had 30 cars in there. And you will find a part for your car in one of those 30 dilapidated cars, but he will fix your car. But the thing about it is, those aspects of the Bahamian vernacular are not. It's, oh, we've progressed. We don't have to live like that. But we look at it as something bad. I look at it as something good and something that we should cherish. How do you see that forecoming, that happening back here in Nassau instead of everybody going out to the outer? Because when they go to outer islands, they're kind of bringing Nassau there, and they're
Right.
building these big.
Hit the mic.
Oh, they're pretty. They're building the big boxes. They're putting them together, and what they're doing is that okay, we have our big house, we have our land, water, but how do you see that if you see it happening?
I could start. I could start, and I could answer, and then he could.
Let the
Okay.
architect go first.
Okay. Listen, I could do architecture as well. Okay. Mhm. So no, but I noticed that revitalization is happening in the east, where Culbert's Hill. Um, what's the other one? Dana, you're right. Culbert's Hill. off of Easton Road. There's a few. Yeah, those larger homes, Winton, that whole entire area, they're fluffing it, I would say. Right, Twynham Heights. Yeah, and yeah, yeah. But they're actually, some of my generation are moving back to their families and living them, or buying homes next to, or building homes next to. So that eastern area that people didn't necessarily feel as though they wanted to go back are now in this year especially are building, renovating. I know at least five, um, and they're appreciating, and those are large homes, and so that gives that culture back. I do think it's important for like Fox Hill and for all these other communities that we do have so much cultural investment that isn't, the people that have moved away don't want to go back. We need to find a way to get people back into those cities so that that culture isn't forgotten or
Yeah, I think something that came up. I'm speaking. The street that you talked about, the community I live in, like this very I moved out in 2020 and I moved back to my childhood property where I grew up. And I think something that we may have to be mindful of, and I pause to say this word um, because it's mindset more than anything. Gentrification is a real thing, and I think we have to be aware of that, even as like Black Bahamians in these communities, going back to these communities with a certain capital attached. Because the, I I moved from Marathon to Carmichael, but Marathon to Carmichael is also still like a different experience. And when we first moved to Carmichael, it was quiet. It was very, very quiet. And then as I got older, it became more bustling. Then the liquor store went on the corner, then the church went on top, and then the bar went across the street. And right, and then like Human Shop is in the same plaza. You know what I mean? So then it developed in that way. And then I moved back to Marathon, and now I realize that I take in with the people who I left there, still being there, but also forgetting that they had affinity to my space as well. So my porch was his porch, was her porch was hers, and for me to then like enact boundaries around that was to be a disruptor in that space, even though that's mine. So then you have this like negotiation of boundaries, interior, exterior, private property versus public, and then urban planning in that there is not any community centers or spaces for people to gather within these like compounds. So how do you negotiate um, all of that from the aspect of community um, as we are thinking about like this development, this movement, this yeah.
Sorry, just touching on because like the thought just came to mind when you were mentioning like gentrification in certain areas, and also thinking about interior exterior. There's something that on a large scale, it's almost like some of these gated communities feel like a private interior that nobody else gets to have, right?
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
also the fact that like a lot of these
Yes.
gated communities are also almost almost always direct next to underserved areas or took up land that was other people's land before,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
we call it like it's kind of it's almost like it's already happening for a lot of people.
It is.
You can't enter these spaces unless you work there for a lot of people, which is also hard. But anyway, there's just something about that weird duality with like gated communities being a sort of private interior for all that I feel like we need to attack at some point. Maybe not right now, but there's something in that. Something in that. Just a little nugget.
Um, before I start, I just want to clarify I am a junior architect. I don't yet have my license. But there are legal implications to that. So I don't want to get sued. But Humans are a creative people, as history, which should also be her story, also have for us is proactive. And those spaces will change, and the way that we design for them will change, not by choice, but by force. And so one of the things that I said to my mom early on when she was reading through my thesis was, she said, "No, I just want to live on this one-story house in Eleuthera," was her dream. And reading through my thesis, she was starting to see that she had questions about whether that would ever be possible. And I said, "I don't want to lie. Sea level is rising over 95% of the island. For the most part, the built part of the island is below sea level. So at some point, we're all one natural disaster away from all of those places being completely devastated where there's no one left to rebuild them, or where we have to really investigate and interrogate where we need to go next." Now, the good news is they're rewriting and working on the new building codes, because they realize that a lot of the regulations and stipulations have not been met by builders and architects to a degree. Um, because climate has changed, we're dealing with different problems, and the architecture now has to respond out of necessity, which is what we used to do before we just developed basic preferences. So I see it changing. I just hope that we do something before it's something that we don't have a choice but to do. Mhm.
What we don't realize is that the urban plan that everybody says is so bad in the Bahamas is one of the most perfect urban planning setups we've ever had. Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and Nassau, Bahamas have the same streets, layout, everything, right down to they have squares. We had roundabouts. Now, that was the organized part for everything urban, and for commerce, for economics, for growth. From that growth, you know, Mason's addition. Those people, they took those little pieces of properties and they built right next to each other, and that gave the character of Nassau, of what everybody deemed was the culture, the beauty of the Bahamas. That's why you had the cat in the fiddle. That's tourists never went into hotels. They went into the inner city, over the hill. Yeah, the whole place was a destination. Absolutely.
So you want to go?
um, how picking up off Danon's what his comment, how do we remind people or expose people to understand that this is valuable? That you drive throughout Nassau, all the front porches, all the buildings that we're talking about, they're still there. But we Bahamians, a lot, like I said, black Bahamians, we don't appreciate what we have.
Mhm.
And then you go in Old Fort Bay, you go to Harbor Island, you go to Lyford Key, you go to the places that have extreme wealth, and they appreciate it and they create. We still have, but maybe some of us don't have the means to revitalize it and make it what it once was. But we still have the memory. I'm 36, but I have the memory of my front porch being the center of the home for my whole entire family. Every Sunday we would all come together, have dinner. All my cousins, all my aunts, uncles, we all would get together. So I'm not the only one in my generation who remember that. And my grandparents, they started from humble beginnings. They didn't end that way, but um, my point is that it architecture shouldn't just be for the privileged. You know, how do we get people to see that or even know that what we have, it might be in shambles, but it's art and it's beautiful.
I think it's important for us as a community to see that, because those homes didn't cost that much. For us to renovate them will not cost that much. For me, I'm gonna invest in where I'm from, Long Island. So but I'm not gonna go in a grand scale because that's just not necessarily my budget. But I will reinvest in that area, and I think if we all take a little bit, even as a family group, invest in one home or multiple, then we can make that change that we're trying to achieve, because having pieces of our culture in luxury home isn't our home. So we need to find a way to make our home our home. You know what I mean? So, reinvesting in Amoco is essential. Of course, we need more funding for that, but there are places and homes in the Bahamas that wouldn't take that much. $100,000 maybe could make a big difference in the space. And it's definitely not buying a new house. If you check, that's not even buying property in the Bahamas, some areas. So, we could consider going back and looking at the properties that you may have in your family lineage, and see how best you can work with this if you have the means. Yeah. And that's the thing, because sometimes you have to do it as a group, and then that that's the village. So right. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we spoke about when we were prepping, Nali mentioned that a lot of the discussions that we have are between designers, between professionals. And so it really needs to change so that the principles, patterns that have worked for us pass on to language, because people perform the language that we produce for them. They don't necessarily speak it. And so if we could change that, which is an educational thing, which is actually what students are working on this semester, is making sure that art, architecture, engineering, um, services, all of these things, and the production of innovative art, architecture as well, is accessible. We don't really talk about architecture in school um, beyond Legos, which have inspired a lot of architects. But again, it's not something that's become seen as a default. Going into my insurance, they didn't even have architects as a profession. And that's how much of a detachment that it is. They had to put me down as a draftsman. And so it's things like that have to be baked into society to make sure it's a priority.
Uh, oh, we have a we have a question from online and then a question from the audience.
We have a question from Facebook from Simone Cambridge. She asks, how do you all relate the interior or public space of the home to collective and individual identity? Thinking about the support teams in relation to this as well. How do you all relate the interior or sorry, the interior or public space of the home to collective and individual identity? Speaking in particular or getting to the I guess the wooden support beams in relation to that as well. I would assume.
Looking at them here, they're multi-elemental, right? And so I think beyond just being a structure that supports itself, it's a metaphor for the family. And so the interior is an indication of your family life. So these elements, as well as those that hold up the substrate as well, are symbols of community. And so even on an individual level, you get your sense of self from community as well. That is based on nurture, not just nurture. Even if it's a reaction or rebellion against what you've been taught, there's still a part of you that has accepted or at least acknowledged that part of yourself. So architecture, interior, are all amalgamations of your understanding of those parts of the design process.
I guess for me, like the main thing that kind of sticks out in my mind is like, as Caribbean people, we're always like, whatever space we're in, whether it's at home or somewhere else, it's like it always feels like this space of transition. We're always trying to like, I feel like, and I also like this about Heinous work. I feel like it's always in a state of becoming. I feel like that's deeply Caribbean and profoundly Caribbean as an experience. And I think that even in our home spaces, that's something that comes up, right? Like we are acted on by our environment, we also act on our environments. It's like we build each other. It's always both are in a like state of becoming. There's something about that that I think is kind of powerful and beautiful because it means that we have some agency. You know what I mean? Like we have agency to be like our own pillars, if you want to think about it that way. Like because these pillars are technically great, which is a beautiful thing. And that's often how we think about people in our communities and like all sort of stuff. Like also like for in Grand Bahama, you lose a building, but if the people are still there, if you manage to still have the people after the storm, that's the thing, right? More than the building. Building's sad. Right? Sad to lose your history, like tangible history. Like we've lost that for so many physical, like so many physical spaces in islands. Because again, people forget like, you know, Ragged Island and everything else. Like there's been a lot going on that we've lost. We have in memory of people. Like there's, I don't know, there's something about how maybe the memory is the pillar. I don't something about that. Like I don't know what it is. And like that gets lost as it or it gets changed, translated as it gets like told, you know, because like 20 years from now, we talk about Dorian, it's gonna be completely different because the context is gonna be completely different. I don't think this answers the question, Simone. I'm very sorry. But you know, it spurred something though, so thank you.
Can you again?
How you all relate to public spaces at home to collective and individual identity.
I think it also tends to provide safety. I think that these pillars and the structure overall gives us as humans a place to feel safe, to gather and feel at home. You know, people always talk about a house. You have to make the house home. A structure doesn't. It's not a home. You have to feel safe. You have to be loved. It has to be cared for. You know, you have to have that feeling. It has to function. So it's more than a house.
Something about like how the design, like you really have to. I think there's also something about like how the design of a space, like you literally have to think about and consider people's needs. So design is like an act of care if you're doing it properly, right? Which is also like, we always think of it as like a very like, sort of linear, right, and just very like this is just like a set of codes that we use and that's it. And it's like no, it's still being enacted by people and it's still being acted on by people.
Ergonomics.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that I don't know if there's like quite a separation between the two, between like your personal identity and you, like the house and the home, um, because they have to, like how they said, live in relationship constantly to one another. So if you're a tall person and you have like short tops, that will make you like disjointed and uncomfortable
Sure.
within your space.
Yeah.
And if your home, yeah, if your home is right, right. And if the structure is a space where you are to find rest, then there needs to be a certain level of comfort within your person in relation to this thing. And I think what I what I think about particularly in this exhibition as well, just to like bring it back here, is that and I say tall because these structures are quite tall in this space, and if the roof of turn did not like elevate at a certain pitch, then they would look quite out of place and they would not hold the same like reverence and like prominence in the space because of their structure in relation to their height in relation to the space. I also think about the fact that as art advisor and art consultant for persons, you learn a lot about people based off of the artwork you like and the artwork that you use with. So and what they surround themselves with to create a sense of pleasure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, so I think it's constantly constantly a relationship when you find people in a place of renovation. It's because they have changed, or something about their person and their personal identities has changed, and there's a need to be a need that was not considered before that needs to be met and addressed. So that's a good question, Simone.
Mhm.
That was a question, audience.
I love that. I need to know how much I love that. That's what it said. That's what it said.
Which is in order to get that type, like bring that for people to see, one, it has to be accessible economically. Because number one, if you don't have much money to engage architecture design, you use normal format that is, and or what other people do, and then because you live in a, you have to look at the health of the community. Because if the community again doesn't have money, and at the same time they are emotionally insecure about their own self, not going to vary outside of the pattern. So in order to get within that pattern, one, you would have to incentivize bringing back these designs. Something could be something as simple as, hey, you're going to build, like you build a guide, make like a guide and put certain criteria. And if you're going to build like that, get 20% off your real property tax for about for 5 years. Something that would be like, oh, this is something to be done. So so your house is home, but if you build a structure and the people within it are not emotionally or physically or anywhere healthy, they're going to run away from the structure, or they're going literally exist in there and not want to do anything with it. So the I actually had a question about the documentation, but I'm just put this out the way first. But so I think that in order to address art, bringing in our history and design, one, you have to address, do people know their own history and how they get there, and are they safe in order to access these services, and then on top of that, is there a bite-sized guide where they can do space, because people are building space because nobody really has access to funding like 100K. So my question was about which is, I think, the documentation, because with climate change, we're going to lose land, period. And yes, and so, and it's going to come faster than we think. So just like how you say that not much people like you who are curating, I think perhaps, is there any suggestions for us so that we can start doing the documentation? Because when the land goes, the people are there. And because the people wherever that they go, they carry the behavior with them. So how do you ensure that is properly documented so that wherever land, or even on boats where they live, how do you bring that piece of architectural history with them?
That's a good question. This also makes me realize that I missed an opportunity to have Tamika here virtually, because I think that she would talk about this like very, very well. Um, in that your personal archives are the archive, and your family photos, the selfies you take with your friends, the pictures you take in your bedroom and your living room, and all that sort of stuff are going to become a wide archive of what Bahamian life is in the next 30 years. And if it's already on the internet, it's already accessible. So there's going to be a time where we're going to have to look at that as the basis of what our archive is. Some archaeologists are going to look at our Facebook photos and be like, okay, how Bahamians live. And I think for us, documentation, if you want to be a bit more deliberate about it, is just healing your relationship to the thing in order to then access it again. Because I think if you carry shame about the community you live in, you won't photograph it, document it from a specific vantage point. If you, yeah, if you like you talked about, if you come from like a situation space is like unhealthy or it's contentious, then you probably won't document it. If you understand what I mean? So I think that there has to be, or if as we kind of like referenced a bit here, we all still do carry trauma in our bodies because of like climate change and the realities of our history here, then we won't engage it because we know that it's an ephemeral thing. And if it is indeed ephemeral, why then should I try to save it if I know that I will lose it? I'm sorry if that was heavy, but I think if we then take the approach of healing or trying to find like an avenue in which to like access it from a preservation aspect rather than an anticipation of loss, then I think we could begin to engage from that perspective. Maybe we could do a wider project.
Yeah. But I think that, and I've had this conversation with hoteliers and whatnot. I think we tourism and investments in tourism, the incentives they receive to develop. I feel as though it's essential for us to have some sort of incentive in order to rebuild these communities that are so important to our culture. A lot of people moved out of the Family Islands in order to, find more work in Nassau, but how do you create more job opportunities in the Family Islands so therefore you develop that culture all over again? So we have to continue to reinvest into ourselves. We can't just focus our number one um, income bracket.
Continue to decenter ourselves.
Right. We can't continue to sell ourselves out without taking care of ourselves. So I think it's important to have these discussions regarding that. It's so easy to say we got wiped out now, but we were there. So you have to kind of think about it as real people,
Yeah.
not as something far away.
And I think it's also like we shouldn't put the onus of the, sort of the recovery and the preservation of things on people who are already in survival mode. Like,
Yeah.
if you are trying to like get your family to be able to eat for that week, you don't want somebody yelling at you about how you like ruining Grammy house. It's like these are two completely different things, two different problems. You know what I mean? But like, it always being somehow like the onus of the individual when this is like everybody's cultural patrimony. All of us should be having some kind of investment in it.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, we're talking about like you shouldn't just do things in anticipation of loss, but like for me, it's like literally growing up in Bahama, like people lost their house. I know people who grew up without baby pictures, you know what they look like as a baby. Like people didn't just lose that in Dorian. You know what I mean? Like
but
it's
I think we all I think what you were saying about the position is like yes, always exists. Like it's inherently Bahamian with an anticipation of loss, especially during a specific few months of the year. So
and it's also an ancestral traumatic response to things,
for sure.
which real.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. What's your name? Sorry? What's your name? All right. Well, I just wanted to say because like I appreciate it because like as a photographer, an artist, I almost kind of took it as like a call to action because one of the things that I do is like aerials. I kind of generally love aerials. It's like added to the exterior because I'm looking. I feel like that's also like another way that we could. How do I segue into this? I guess the people who've already known older folks can help educate, and then like people like artists like us and ourselves, like we can like help to kind of like perpetuate the rhetoric and continue photographing or showing the country because that was one of my things. I always, in a weird way, felt like proof that show the Bahamas that are Bahamian, if that makes sense, as well as I have now only photos or aerial photos of Abaco pre-Dorian, and I'm from Abaco, in Abaco at 17, 18 years old, and it'll never look the same way again. So people being born today, tomorrow, whenever, like we'll never know what it was. I think it's important to document that, to keep that in history or as a part of our history too, because like you can't, no matter where you go, you Bahamian, right? No matter which country you move to, if it's an English speaking country, otherwise, whatever it is, like you are always through and through Bahamian down to your core in your DNA. And there's nothing and no one that can take that away from you. I think it's important for us to, especially, I don't remember who said it, the educational aspect of it, because I think that touched to your question, that's an important way too, because education, like, there's a lot of things that I didn't realize and were enlightened about coming here today. You know what I mean? So I can't speak to anyone else who knows like what else anyone else has learned or picked up from in this conversation alone, let alone other things that their grandma or their Annie or their mom. You know what I mean? I think that's one way we could all kind of help get involved, if that makes sense. But anyway, just I wanted to say I appreciate you framing it the way you did, because it helped me kind of look within myself as well and kind of like kind of what is going on here.
Sorry, and just on that, there's also something about the fact that even though you worked in hospitality for a very long time, you weren't doing this for tourist gaze and you weren't doing it for tourism in mind, which is also very, very, very important, very specific. And again, that's also another reason why I find, just to tie back to Heino's work isn't about making stuff that tourists think is interesting. It's about taking stuff that Bahamians know and kind of flipping it and making it a different way to reconsider it. If you feel like you're sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out, like for me anyway, 1 foot in, 1 foot out sometimes with like Bahamian culture, feeling like your access is like kind of not always there. It does a very interesting, a really, really like important thing, I think.
I was going to add to Adrian's comment about his own work because I showed it as a curator at the Diaguilar Art Foundation. And I think it was a little too soon after Dorian for people to feel receptive to it, because it was like magic. We were doing a show about Dorian. It wasn't actually the curator, to be honest. It was Yasmin Glinton, the curator. So I was just assisting. But I think somebody sent your work to me, and I was like completely blown away by the idea that somebody would have documented their island in such a systematic way. And you could tell that it was somebody who was an artist without knowing they were an artist, which gives me goosebumps when I meet somebody like that. And it happens every so often where you're like, oh, holy crap, this person is incredible, but didn't know. And I just wanted to add to it because I think that it's actually a part of history. But his work was only once, as far as I know, at the DAX, right post Dorian, when it was too fresh. It was too fresh. I don't think it's been kind of put in contextualized, but I had never seen that before or since. So, yeah.
Also give people a way to process, I think, which is important.
Time. But speaking about Adrian's artwork, to crash some of those photography sessions, and really and truly, it's not just about the photography. We definitely had like a full Bahamian experience. We went to the pool hole, went to the long dock. We had conversations about, what this was before and what it could be in the future. And those experiences, can be curated instead of our typical tourist type of focus. Yeah, we made it was for us. Like some of those photos only Adrian and I, and I'm sure you've seen, but it's a curated catalog. It's gorgeous, and I can't wait for it to.
Yeah. So I'm just watching the clock, and I know that we have a question online, so that'll be our last question, and then I will properly thank everyone.
Yeah, we have a question from Ide Thompson. She asks, what are some of the ways we are creating new or adapting old building techniques to prepare for rising sea levels, as well as rising temperatures, a drier climate? for Alexis.
So this goes for any experience. Once you acknowledge that something is happening, you can respond to it. So early buildings, as we can see there on the left, you can see that those buildings are elevated on small hikes. Um, you can see this in Savannah. You can see it in Charleston to a degree. And so we're reinterpreting this with understanding that those may not be high enough. Now, accessibility, not just to building, is also accessibility in terms of walkability and access for those who may have unique capacities. So those in wheelchairs, how would they adapt to life at a higher level? And these are questions that we're starting to now have to ask. Other countries already started adapting to life on water, for example, the Netherlands. Now, their economy is much larger than ours is, so they're able to do these things. But also, um, I mean, that wealth is built on something. But I think one thing that we've been afraid of is to know that we don't need permission to be artists. We don't need permission to be creative or responsive to our environment. So as we're starting to develop these new codes, we have an understanding the buildings should reflect the time in which they were built. But we now need to start asking the question, not only who were we and who are we in the present, who do we want to be, and do we want to still be around to have these conversations, to be able to look at the documentation and then to have conversations about what these things meant. A lot of art that we capture here is explained in the oral space, right? But a lot of it is silent work if the artist isn't there to discuss it or if there's not writing to help. Not everyone can read or write. So again, is this something that we should be capturing in the sound arena to be able to pass on the patterns and principles of what we're doing? Height is the major thing. A lot of the higher spaces, places, and sites in Nassau in particular, as well as some of the other places in the Bahamas, aren't accessible to locals. That land is saved for future development by families who happen to have ownership of that land. For people who are so defined by a landscape and seascape, it's an interesting place to be, knowing that that is such a beautiful thing that we have the opportunity to live nearby, but it's also the thing that could destroy us. So having respect and acknowledgement for that will help us make better decisions and better building decisions as we move forward. So it's about being proactive. It's happening on a certain scale, but even in Dorian, some of the most beautifully built, largest, most grand homes washed away at sea. So again, that's an indication the way we've built isn't enough to be dealing with in the very near future.
And then also speaking about that, I think it also goes about talking about our budget, because cutting costs is some of the reasons why things didn't work out as well as we wanted to.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for your generosity. And thank you, audience, for your generosity. This was quite a participatory experience, so thank you very much. So, and yeah, I was gonna say thank you so much to Heino for your work, for just general housekeeping. And this house is a home is on view until March 11th. So you have time to come and see the show. We are open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 to 6 p.m. On March 11th, we're actually having a workshop with Heino, and we'll be disseminating more information about that in the upcoming week. So please stay tuned for that. You can follow us on Instagram at Turn Gallery, or just TEN Gallery, and Facebook by the same name. And if you would like to contact us, you could reach us at info@turngallery.com. Thank you, everyone. Good night.